Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another edition of All Aces on Air. And today I have the wonderful Aaron Clark-Ginsberg of the Rand Corporation. So today we will be talking about emergency management, racial equity, and disaster risk reduction, which is a lot of stuff to cover in 1 hour, but we're going to do our best. And so you all know that this is a very relational show. Our goal is always to bring the humanity into the space, regardless of what we're talking about at the intersection of racial equity. That said, what I will do is just talk a little bit about Aaron and then have Aaron introduce himself to you all. So, first of all, I have had the pleasure of observing from a distance Aaron do amazing research around how can we as a society, both in America and internationally, he's done a bunch of international research too, to reduce the impact of disasters on real people's lives. And so I have been a big fan of his work as a emergency management nerd myself, and just a nerd in general, but emergency management in particular. And I really appreciate who he is as a person. We've had several conversations over the years, and he has always showed up with full humanity and consideration for other people, for the not just the work, but really making sure that compassion and empathy, more accurately, empathy is there. So I just want to say thank you, Aaron, for being you. Thank you for all the work that you do. And so I'm going to turn it over to you to tell folks who are watching us, um, who are you, right? I've talked about your work, but that's not who you are. So tell us about yourself, Aaron.
Sure. Thanks, Atyia, and thanks for having me on, and the really sweet and wonderful intro. And I've really enjoyed watching and reading some of your work over the years too. So it's fun, and let's nerd out a little bit today. So yeah, I'm a disaster researcher by, I guess, training and background, and just hobbies and interests. I've been working on disaster related issues for, Katrina was my first sort of foray into everything, and that kind of got my brain spinning. I was I think a naive freshman at the time, and in college, and saw this thing happen, and thousands of people dead, recovery and response that took forever and is still ongoing. And I decided I wanted to do something, and there's a group going down with my college. I went down with the college, did some volunteering, did some more volunteering, ended up staying there, on and off for a while, and that kind of got me down this path. I think the thing that was really sort of motivated me and kind of continues to motivate me was just, we would go in as this group, and it was all sort of good, fun college stuff, like a bunch of teenagers hanging out. But then we would go to these houses where people were, their entire lives were completely destroyed. Their houses were destroyed, and we would go there and we would gut the house. So rip out stuff that had been damaged by the hurricane and try and get it up to scratch for sort of rebuilding. And that was rewarding in itself, but I think you chat with people who were, often the families were there while we were doing this stuff, and just sort of hearing their stories of, this hurricane hit, these levees failed, this system that we relied on, it wasn't working. And now we are, metaphorically high water and trying to figure out how to survive. And the little support that we were providing, like this sort of fun field trip, it like meant so much to them. And it's like, I don't know, it shouldn't mean so much to them. It should just be like, they have support, they have resources, or this thing didn't even happen. That's my long-winded intro to sort of the disaster space. Since then, I've I worked as a wildland firefighter for a while. Then went off to
wait, go back. You said a what firefighter?
I was a wildland firefighter. So this was
you kept that one under the hat.
yeah.
Secret. Keep going.
The secret. Another sort of summer job of interest in disasters again. This one, I really like the outdoors. I like hiking. I like doing sort of physical things, running, cycling, all that stuff. And this seemed like an ideal summer job where you could also make a lot of money and get some adventure. So yeah, I signed up for a summer, ended up, I don't know how well you know the wildfire world, but you have state, you have feds, then you have contract crews, which are private sector crews. Found a job for a contract crew and worked with them for 2 seasons before transitioning over to work for the state of Washington for another 2. And kind of different, because in this case, instead of hanging out with the survivors of disasters, you're hanging out in the woods with a bunch of other disaster workers trying to kind of contain this threat, this emerging threat. Kind of similar too, in that on the worker side, it's it's almost like a similar experience to the survivor, in that for me it was a summer job. It was pocket change for me and savings for me, and useful, but I was getting my degree. For the other workers, it's they're scraping by, and this isn't necessarily an adventure for them. It's how they're making their living, and they're making very little living, and they're exposed to a lot of hazards, and I think they're they're sort of part of the disaster machine, and feeling some of its problems by being in a position of sort of labor precarity, responding to risk. So yeah, I mean, it was really different experience, but and different populations, but that narrative was still there for that.
So
yeah,
thank you for sharing that, because I'm learning stuff about you, Aaron. And one of the things I wanted to highlight is that you do work for the RAND Corporation, and all of your thoughts today are coming from Aaron Clark-Ginsberg, right? And so these are the opinions of Aaron, not of the RAND Corporation. However, for those who don't know the RAND Corporation and what it is and why it's such a big deal, can you just give a little bit of context on that, and then we can talk a little bit about some of the work that you have done over the years? Yeah,
sure. So I'm a researcher at the RAND Corporation. The RAND Corporation is, I think it's the largest nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank in the U.S. I work with, I think, over 1,000 PhDs in all different disciplines. I'm this social science mutt. I work with engineers, political scientists, economists, all different types of pretty smart people. And our goal is to do research that makes an impact and makes a difference. So half of our work, and this is the stuff that I don't really do, half of the work is more sort of defense oriented. So it's like a manpower study for the Air Force, where you need to figure out how you retain Air Force employees and support families, something like that. The other half is the non-defense related work, which is what I do. This is very broad. It can be anything from education to healthcare, and supporting a variety of clients. So, some of the government entities like FEMA, we do work with and for FEMA. CDC, I'm doing work for CDC right now on incident management, actually.
We have some things to talk about there.
Yeah, and that's a 3-year project that's been a little bit delayed because of this global pandemic we're in right now. Yeah, and then the other stuff is more of the academic research. So I'm doing some work that's funded by National Science Foundation, NSF, basic research on disasters and community resilience type stuff. So yeah, it's fun. It's a mix of research reports for government, non-governmental entities, writing journal articles for academic community, and then I write other smaller things like op-eds and blogs and stuff like that, and conduct some of the research behind it too.
So with all of that said, what would you say, because you've written a lot of research reports, Aaron. I looked, I checked. and
too many.
Well, in a good way. It's impressive. That's a lot of work. And one of the things that I was curious about is, you have this breadth of research you've done, and there is this throughput of disaster risk reduction, emergency management. What is your favorite report you've worked on so far?
Man, that's a hard one. I've done work inside and outside of the US, and I think I'm partial to my earlier stuff because it was all so much more new and exciting. And, I was really thinking hard about these things and trying to figure out, what disasters are all about, what the field of disaster studies is all about. So, I think what I'm most proud of is, as part of my PhD, I partnered up with this international NGO, Concern Worldwide, and spent 2 years with them, going to 10 different countries to look at concerns, basically community-based disaster risk reduction work. So Concern would go poorest of the poor areas in some of the poorest countries. So, Niger, Afghanistan, Haiti, Kenya, Bangladesh, the places where Concern works. And, it would take, I went to these places, and it's first you fly to the country, and then, you hang out in the capital for a day getting briefed. Then you take, either a second flight, or if flights aren't available, you'll hop in a 4x4 and drive for, a day or so to get to the secondary office. And then by, the third day or so, that's when you can get out and get to the field sites where these interventions are taking place. So it's, it takes forever to get these places. And for Concern, I spent, 2 years working with them, wrote up 10 country reports of Concern's work in these different countries, and then synthesized them into comparative reports of, this is how you do disaster risk reduction in mountain regions, or in urban regions, or coastal regions. For me, that work was kind of eye-opening, seeing the real impacts of risk and disasters that communities face. And, I think it was fascinating personally, just being there. The reports themselves, they provide something that I think the field is lacking a little bit, which is just sort of descriptive. This is kind of what it takes to reduce risk and use community-based approaches. This is what a project looks like. So I'm happy that they're there, but I think thinking about those, it's more of just kind of the personal journey that that I'm reminded of whenever I pick them up.
Which brings us to another good point, which is you started talking about communities and the power of kind of grassroots approaches. As we, all ACES focuses on confronting racism and advancing racial equity. And so, with that lens of understanding how pervasive racism is, how it is systemic, um, how it impacts us as individuals, in terms of how we see ourselves, how we engage with each other, how we show up in organizations where we're making policies, where we're writing research, and all of these pieces. Um, what have you learned through your research that helps people better understand the way racism is operating in disasters, or the way that the opportunities that you see for advancing racial equity in the work?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question, and I think that there's, for me at least, I think of it in two different ways.
Mm.
One of them is, it's called the social construction of risk, and the associated vulnerability paradigm, where if we want to use the jargon. But this is a sort of field of disaster studies that I tend to associate myself with, or I try and associate myself with, and basically argues that the reason there are disasters and the reason people suffer because of crises and disasters are things like racism, like marginalization, like vulnerability. So going back to Katrina, for instance, it's there's communities in low-level areas, levees break, nobody cares. A larger number of deaths if you're Black, harder time recovering because you have fewer resources, and it's more difficult to access those resources. And you're seeing this with COVID right now too. That's another, here's one that we're living through, where if you're poor, if you're marginalized, you're often you have higher exposure to COVID itself, to its economic impacts. And it's harder if you're hit to recover. Maybe you have more pre-existing conditions. You have less savings. It's all of those things are the things that create the disaster. So that's one area, which is the sort of social construction of risk and why disasters disproportionately affect some segments of the population versus the other. The other one that I've been trying to think a lot more on, and I think this one's harder personally, is the field of disaster studies itself, and my position within the field of disaster studies. And I mean, the Concern Project is a great example here of, here's a guy who doesn't know about these countries per se, who's been hired by this international NGO, and flies and travels 3 days to write about something for this organization that then they can use for raising funds and spreading knowledge and good stuff. At the same time, it's that's sort of an extractive practice for those communities, and they're getting something from it. They're getting longer term support, and they can use it to kind of advocate for themselves. And if I take it upon myself to interpret that the right way, then I can help elevate their voices. But it's also, I'm sort of the intermediary, and if I misinterpret, or if I think something else, then they don't have much power. I mean, the other side, so, and that kind of relates to these broader issues of, who has power and control within this field of practice. Something I'm no longer a PhD student. I'm now leading projects and, first authoring a lot of papers and doing those things. So, that's one of the things I'm trying to do is in my personal work, try and change that a little bit. So there's a lot of really good papers out there by young scholars, young scholars of color, and it's really easy to cite the same people that have been cited all the time. So I'm trying to remember to do those sorts of little things, trying to structure projects in a way that gives other people more of a say, more of control over the projects, and more voices. But yeah, I mean, it's an issue that's both in disasters itself, but then also in how we think about disasters and who gets to talk about them.
Now, what's interesting, what you said that I want to just highlight for the audience is, the power dynamics of disaster research, right?
Yeah.
So on the one hand, the first part is that you're the intermediary, right? And which to your point leaves space for kind of our own interpretations of the world to filter people's experiences. And one of the things we talk a lot about at All Aces and on All Aces on Air is voice and choice, right? That one of the major ways that oppression perpetuates itself, and in this case, we're talking about racism, is people's voices not really being heard or being silenced, or people not having any influence or choice in the issues that are directly impacting them, including their own narratives. And so I just wanted to explicitly state, explicitly call that out as something very powerful that that you are seeing on the disaster side and the research side. And I'm really interested in a conversation that we started to have earlier, which was about kind of the challenges with the fact that we have done so much research, to your point, disaster risk management. And actually, I'm going to pause here for a moment because um, you mentioned people having, people expecting certain folks to be cited in papers and things like that. So I have, several things published. Y'all know I'm a nerd. And one of the things I have published, I remember when you publish a journal article, there are usually three, on average, three people who you don't know who they are, and they are reviewing your work. And they're giving you feedback once you submit your paper, and you're adjusting it based on their feedback. And then through their approval of how you've adjusted yourself, your things get published. And when I published my paper on the intersection of kind of resilience in cities and risk reduction and emergency management, the focus really was on kind of underestimated people in our society. And I remember one of the reviewers, blind reviewers, saying, well, you're saying that what you're proposing is good for the field, but you don't even talk about, I won't say the researcher's name who they said that I didn't talk about, but you don't even talk about this person, and their thing is the gold standard for how this works, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
And my response was, well, there's a reason why I thought it was necessary to come up with this framework, because number one, that approach that this particular researcher takes is great academically. But when it comes to decisions that need to be made on the ground, when it comes to explaining this to an elected official who is making decisions in real time about how to distribute resources, that this approach that that this person uses really doesn't help in those situations. It's hard to explain because of the statistical gyrations that you have to go through. And I didn't say this in my response, and I know for a fact people who have taken courses with this person, that the person that admits that, there are a lot parts of the statistical gyrations that go into it that, and so and so I said, what I can do is acknowledge that the research exists, because that's really important. Because you do want to acknowledge all those folks. Um, and uh, and that I'm providing this as an alternative for practitioners, right? As someone who is a practitioner, and I amazingly, it got published. However,
Yes.
however, it was a very it was one of those moments of kind of truth, right, where your integrity is on the line. It's like, well, I could just go along with this in the way,
Yeah.
exactly the way that they're telling me that I need to rewrite this or I need to frame this. And it's hard as a researcher who really cares about these issues when you're bumping up against those kind of situations. So so I share that story to amplify the message around how hard it is. And then the where I wanted to go to was, we were talking about earlier before the show was live, about kind of the challenges with all of this research, right? Like there's so much research, and it's amazing research, and we've learned so much from all that has been done. However, Aaron, what's the problem?
The problem is we aren't using it. Like, yeah, I talked about, the social construction of risk and the vulnerability paradigm that I'm try and operate in and try and work within. It's about talking about power dynamics and how power dynamics shape disasters. And yeah, we're still learning stuff. And there's always more to figure out, but this field, this area of thinking, it started in the 1960s. We've had the basics down since the 1960s. Yet we're still at the same or relatively the same stage when it comes to implementing these interventions and, thinking in this sort of way. So,
Wait,
you know,
before
un,
before
yeah,
you go forward, when you say these interventions, what kind of interventions are you talking about?
basically justice-focused interventions where, going back to Katrina or COVID, you recognize that the reason that people are dying is because they're marginalized, is because they're in positions of powerlessness, is because society has given them the short stick and they don't have the resources necessary to implement mitigation activities, and respond and recover adequately.
Mm.
That disasters are social failures that expose social inequities, and should be treated as such, not that somebody is either in the wrong place at the wrong time, they're
Mm.
unlucky, or that they just don't care because they choose to live in a floodplain, right? Which is often what people end up saying. It's not the case. It's that they can't afford to live anywhere else, or that they were, they live in a community that was redlined and redlined in high risk areas. I live in Portland. Portland, we despite being constantly called a completely white city, we have a Black population. That population was historically excluded from Portland. We had night acts where after it got dark, you had to leave. There were suburbs in Portland called Vanport that a large Black population, like Portland's Black populations, lived in.
Mhm.
High risk area, Vanport flooded. That group got wiped out, and yeah, it's kind of frustrating because I think as a field we have been saying a lot of this stuff for a long time. Yet disasters are still sort of naturalized as either an individual failing, living in the floodplain or not wearing a mask, or as an act of God of oh yeah, it kind of happens, and wrong place at the wrong time. So yeah, I don't know. I've been trying to change that narrative, but
Aaron, we need to do some collective action to make sure that we shift this narrative, because the way that you just framed um, how the ideology of disaster management has been working particularly when it comes to people of color, poor people, um, is the same thinking that happens with racism in general, right? It's either an individual failing. Why can't you just pick yourself up by the bootstraps? Why can't you be a superhero and like navigate all of the structural barriers that are in your way? Why can't you be resilient enough? Why can't you navigate the uh, the your own individual failings, right?
yeah,
Like there's a lot of that.
yeah.
And, this other piece, what was the second part you said? There's the individual
Oh, that it's wrong place at wrong time.
wrong place, wrong time, right? Like that
Yeah,
bad apple. I
yeah,
I could just,
yeah,
that's not a it's not a pattern, right?
yeah,
It's
yeah,
not a systemic or structural issue. It's just things happen. And we all struggle, right? And it's like this normalization of things that are unjust and should not be justified. Um, and so we have some folks who are posting in the comments. Um, Amelia Tracy, thank you for joining us tonight on Facebook. Doesn't that help us unite the language we use to describe why this work is so critical? Yes, right. And that I'm assuming that Tracy means is this intersection, the way that these parallel tracks of how racism and oppression work, and the language and constructs that we use, and kind of the social construction of risk, those parallel worlds that currently are very separate, right? Like the disaster research, even when it is talking about racism and racial equity, is very separate from like
yeah.
everything else talking about
Just
social
talking
justice,
about it in a different way. Yeah, yeah,
talking about it in a
totally.
very different way.
Yeah,
And
we use the language of vulnerability, and I don't know. I like that language, but it can also be misconstrued or depoliticized, right? We can. There's research out there that talks about the relationship between vulnerability and poverty, and doesn't necessarily talk about why poverty exists, which is this marginalization and political processes that place people at risk, right? So,
Mhm.
I think or gender, right, or race. That if you're a woman or if you're black, you're more likely to die, but doesn't get into why. And so
Mhm.
that the language of vulnerability and disasters, if it's done right, it can be quite useful. But it's very easy just to kind of brush away some of those broader problems that you're talking about with that language.
Yes, and it's a pattern we also see in our work, both when we're dealing with explicitly around emergency management or climate mitigation or any of those things. You see a similar pattern.
Yeah,
You see that same pattern in when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion in
sure.
organizations, right? It's like, let's not talk about racism, or let's not use explicit language. Let's just talk about diversity in general, and like, things that make us feel a little more comfortable.
Yeah.
Um, so thank you for bringing that into the space, and thank you, Amelia, for that. And then we also have one of our repeat viewers here who is a former colleague of mine way back in the day, back in my emergency management days, Kevin O'Hara Shanley. Good to see you, Kevin. And who is also very interested in this intersection of kind of disasters and social inequities. And I think as we are navigating through this, in this moment that we're in right now of struggle, right? Of disappointment, I think there's a lot of frustration around um, the fact that it seems like so many Americans um, have bought into ideas that are the opposite of things that are aligned with how complicated the real world is.
Yeah.
That are
And people are dying as a result as we
people are
speak,
dying
right?
as a result as we speak.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious from where you sit. So we laid out a number of challenges, and I want to sit with this challenge around the disaster research, right? Like so we're not doing it. So which how do we close that gap, right? So let's talk about it. Um,
I wanted to ask you that how to how to close the
oh,
gap.
you want me to answer? Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
I
Let
want
me
you to
see what
answer. I have no idea.
I. So I think part of the challenges in how I always like to think about things is always like kind of systems, um, and when we understand that a lot of what happens on the ground in disasters is influenced by elected officials and the people that they have chosen to be in these emergency management roles.
Mhm.
And the so when we think about strategies, policy is an important strategy. And as I mentioned to you earlier, there's this saying that culture will eat policy for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, like every time. And so, not to say to diminish the power of policy, but to say that we need multiple strategies. And so, policy is important. In order to for policies to be most effective, there has to be a narrative shift, right? There has to be a shift in our fundamental framework, worldview on the issue we're trying to change. And in this case, emergency management. I am I'm not shocked. I am disappointed in how many people, including elected officials who are responsible, closest to the folks who are going to be making decisions, um, don't understand emergency management at all. It's almost like, and I'm guessing this is true. It's almost like there's no briefing, there's no like in public policy world, there's no introduction to like these are all the different parts of government.
Yeah.
Because emergency management is an important part of government. So this one piece is like this lack of understanding from local and state officials unless they've been through a lot of disasters, and even then it depends. um
Yeah, even then, are they actually going to do the right thing, or
exactly.
not? Even if you have the understanding, it also takes, I don't know, some courage to act.
Yes, and to call out the inequities, right?
Yeah,
I mean, even if we think about COVID-19, how it took so long for folks to just admit that Black people and our Latinx brothers and sisters were disproportionately bearing the burden of COVID-19.
yeah,
Even though those of us who've been doing this work for a long time could have told you that right at the beginning. Hey, this is how this is going to play out,
yeah, yeah.
right? So
There's
that
60 years of research saying this is how it's going to play
exactly
out. So, yeah,
right. It's a predictable pattern.
yeah,
Um, the other piece is kind of the collective. When I talk about collective action, okay, so that's elected officials, but then we also have folks who are advocates closest to communities, who also many of them are filling the gaps that government is leaving because of our lack of learning our lessons. We do all the stuff around lessons learned that we like to mention. Um,
learned but not implemented. Yeah, yeah,
yeah, they're in a lot of reports. After action
yeah,
reports is full of them. Um, but this idea, if they're honest, like, and then some after action reports are very political, so like that's a
yeah,
whole nother story for another day. Um, and for folks who don't know, an after action report is like the official documentation of a disaster or emergency that shows kind of here's what went well based on all the things we were supposed to do based on the standards that the federal government has set for the way we do this work, and here are the things that did not go so well, and here, based on what didn't go so well, here's our timeline and commitment to address the gaps that we saw.
And those, I mean, those can be good for improving organizational performance and response if they're done appropriately.
They're done appropriately.
I even take issue. I mean, I'm just kind of maybe a little bit annoyed these days, or a little bit depressed these days. But I mean, I even take issue with these AARs, these after action reviews, and that they often fail to do that deep dive into why this happened and what placed people at risk. So it focuses on the response, not the creation of that disaster risk. And there's a good reason not to do that, because that's pointing blame and accountability at a system or a group of people for exacerbating vulnerability and creating exposure. So that's really challenging. Nobody wants to do that.
It is. And if we claim that we want to get better and that these are lessons learned, the opportunity that we have is to not fall into the usual human, conditions of running away from mistakes. We all make mistakes. No person is perfect. No organization is perfect. No response is perfect. No recovery is perfect. And if we are committed to the people we're serving, then we are actively seeking out these lessons so that we can improve what we're doing. Right? It's not a if we're being authentic about it, it's not an indictment on whether or not you're an awful human being, right? What it is an opportunity to see where the broken places are and fix them, right? Like this is and the same pattern we see with organizations. People take these things very personally instead of focusing on fixing the problems. Anyone who brings up the problems, in many cases, you become the problem instead of like the problem that we're supposed to be fixing. But all of that to say, the other opportunity that we have is to partner with communities who are filling in the gaps that government are leaving. Right? We know that there are a number of grassroots organizations who are bootstrapping themselves and just filling in gaps that government has left in Black communities, in Latinx communities, in communities, in really poor communities, rural communities, which are not necessarily mutually exclusive. There are people of color who live in rural areas, just contrary to popular belief. But this idea of how we can help them also have the knowledge and information that they need to partner to shift the narrative as well, right? Because when people closest to the ground understand, oh, wait, not only am I filling a gap that the government's supposed to be doing right now, but there's actually federal money that went to the state that we don't know where it went, right? Like you got reimbursed, so for folks who don't know, when there's a disaster and it's federally declared, like COVID-19 is a federally declared disaster, there's federal money that comes with that. Every time it goes to the state first. And the state, so usually it's a reimbursement thing, so that you spend the money, you get the money back. What's fascinating is, and wearing another hat, doing work, community activism, I've seen no accountability. Where did all the money go? What did it get spent on? Like, I know folks are getting reimbursed, and there are these, and there'll be these line items where they'll say, we'll reimburse you up to this much, right? So I'll give a concrete example. So in Massachusetts, there was $20 million that was supposed to be allocated to it was allocated to the state for them to get reimbursed on in order to address the racial inequities associated with COVID-19's impacts.
It's great.
It sounds great on paper,
Yeah.
right? Like that's amazing. Where the hell did that money go? No idea. And one of my colleagues in our coalition reached out to the governor's office, and the representative that they spoke with basically was like, "Oh, that's hardly any money. Like that money's already accounted for." But it's like, but where did
it's only 20 million? Yeah,
only 20 million. It was like, but where did it go, right? And
don't
so
worry
I
about
say
it.
all of that to say that when folks have more information and tools and are connected with folks like you who kind of get no, these are the things that need to happen in order for us to have the kind of mitigative action that transforms us from bouncing back to the old way things were, which sucked for a lot of people, to bouncing forward in a way where we're addressing the foundational, structural, process, policy, framing, and narrative issues that got us here in the first place.
Yeah.
Right? That are going to actually reduce the impact of disasters.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's like, and this is fascinating. I mean, it's like COVID. You don't want just a bounce back return to normal, because normal is horrible for a lot of people. I mean, pretty good for me. Like I've got a decent job, and I'm socially isolating right now. I'm doing okay. But for a lot of other people, not so great. And we don't want to just turn that recovery into, returning to normal. We want to turn it into something different. And I think, I'm putting my international hat on here. I've, going to all of these countries, they're places with incredibly limited resources, right? The state has limited resources. Its reach is usually pretty slim. Traveling a couple of days from the capital, there's not much there when it comes to support structures. So almost by necessity, they call them community-based disaster risk reduction or disaster risk management. These sort of community structures have been put in place to mitigate risk, to respond, to recover. They have their problems. It's maybe a little bit of bootstrapping at the community level. It's placing a lot of responsibility on communities to solve their own problems. That's kind of the downside of this. But the upside, which is what you're talking about, is it provides a voice, it provides accountability, and it provides a way for communities to be heard and real issues to be sort of discussed. So, I mean, and it's really interesting, right? Like I was in Haiti after the earthquake, went in and was chatting with a lot of Haitians about what they want, what they need, and what sort of mitigation strategies should be put in place to reduce risk. And the earthquake, it killed 200,000 people. Pretty devastating. But what they were saying is that no, it's not the earthquakes that we're worried about. That was a one-off. That happens every once in a while. We're dealing with the daily disasters of poverty, of lack of clean drinking water, and maybe some of the longer term or the more repeating ones like the hurricanes that happen on a yearly basis. So it's when you actually talk to people and get their views, it can be kind of different. The priorities can be kind of different to what an official response structure might have. These community groups too, like they also, not only do they provide certain resources when it comes to like the material benefits of mitigation. So support for a flood wall, for instance. But also kind of the immaterial stuff that's super important in a time of crisis. So, it's FEMA is a big bureaucracy, and
Really?
and it works as a big bureaucracy, and it tries to distribute funds and move the rebuilding process forward. What it doesn't provide is emotional support for populations who are going through something that's pretty traumatic. Community groups, they operate at a smaller level, often comprised of members of that community. They can move a bit slower, and they can think a bit more beyond just kind of the material needs. So yeah, I mean, it's these strategies, this community-based approach, it's not perfect, and it can definitely be dangerous if you do it the wrong way. You can place too much responsibility on communities.
Right, in absence of the whole government infrastructure.
Yeah.
And you got to which brings this place of like the on the spectrum, right? In an ideal world, our government at the federal, state, and local level, and particularly at the state and local level, would be partnering with communities to do this kind of
Yeah.
thinking and work together, right?
Yeah.
Because government can't do it alone, communities can't do it alone, and I'll add in the private sector, both for profit and nonprofit, like that. All of us have different responsibilities, and in the most cases, communities are not part of governance in how we
Yeah.
think about the decisions that
Totally.
are made.
Yep.
Um, and so when we talk about voice and choice in this context, making sure that communities are just at the table, right? Because that's an illusion, and I know that's what a lot of folks, that's how, the language a lot of folks use, want to be at the table, but the reality is, if you can be at the table and they can just ignore you. I've watched it work
Yeah.
in government,
Or
right?
they'll consult you. They'll get your views.
Exactly.
Say you think that water and sanitation is important. They'll get your views. When the decision gets made, it's somebody else is making the decision. I see that. I mean, that's the other problem. It's the devil's in the detail with this stuff.
Hmm.
It's who has decision making authority and power, and whose voices are heard in that stage too.
Exactly. And so for the in an ideal world, we'd be at that higher end of community engagement and partnership,
Yeah.
where we're not just consulted, here's what we decided, don't you love it? But that we would be having conversations right from the beginning. Let's talk about the problem we're actually trying to solve for and the dynamics of it, so that we're clear and we have all the context. And I've been
Yeah.
folks who have watched before know that I always talk about the content experts and the context experts, and that community members are the context experts, not just the organizations that we're comfortable with that engage with communities, but the actual people in communities on the ground closest to the work, who are filling the gaps that everyone is leaving. That they are part of how we frame the problem. They're part of how we think about what the trade-offs are, because there's always burdens and
Mhm.
benefits associated with the decisions we make from a policy perspective, or any perspective for that matter. And how do we navigate all the way through, from engagement all the way through to implementation? And that as part of implementation, we're making sure that those benefits that come out of this work also benefit the community, right? So
Yeah.
this idea of community members being able to weigh in meaningful ways about the decisions, but also if we're spending money to rebuild, how do we make sure that all the contractors that we're paying, like, aren't from people from outside the community, that we're actually investing the money in the
Yeah.
community that we're working,
Yeah. Well,
right?
and it's also super hard to do, and there's some very sort of practical issues that make it really challenging, right? Like differences in scale. I mean, FEMA is huge, and community groups are tiny, and how do you work with these hundreds of tiny little groups? There's like emergence issues after every disaster.
Mhm.
New community groups pop up to provide those essential services when the government is unable or unwilling to do that. You can partner with the group beforehand, so when the crisis hits, you know who to talk to, and you can hit the ground running. With these emergent groups, it's really hard, and it's hard keeping track of them. There's also like accountability issues of like, I don't know, FEMA needs an appropriate sort of governance regulatory structure. You need to have oversight and all that stuff. A lot of these little groups don't have those like systems in place to interface with FEMA. The
And
thing is, it's not on them. It's not on the community groups to figure this out. It's on
it's on
the
FEMA,
organization. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
right? And we also know that the state and local government, like, it's not like FEMA just jumps to the
yeah,
community.
yeah,
And
yeah,
so the state and local government play a role in making sure that they're building those relationships before FEMA ever shows up,
yeah,
because that is supposed to be the kind of the connecting point for FEMA and what's happening on the ground, even
Yeah.
when things are really, really, really bad. And what I've seen, especially during COVID-19, is there's also, I think, an opportunity for us to invest in the kind of civic and community infrastructure that, because it has not been invested in
Hmm.
communities,
Hmm.
so that those touch points can be facilitated in meaningful ways. That
Hmm.
and us in communities are coordinating with each other, so that if I have my kind of small nonprofit, even if we don't have a 501c3, we're connected with other groups and who do have a 501c3, and we're all going to collaborate in order to do this work together.
Yeah.
And we're going to have a fiscal sponsor, right? Like these things are so like from a practical perspective, like we can work through them. The challenge is, we need to have a clear pathway forward. We need the political will, both in the highest levels of government, state and local level, and as communities are kind of living, every community in the country now kind of living in this disaster moment, kind of are getting exposed to a lot of things that they've never been exposed to before. Like
Yeah.
I've been very interested in a lot of the emergency management jargon. I'm hearing now that was like just, used to be us in like emergency operations center throwing around these things.
Right. Build Back Better was part of Biden's campaign, right? Like Build
Yeah.
Back Better is this jargon that emergency managers always talk about. I can't believe it made, yeah.
And so, and then as we start to wind down, I do want to mention this whole piece around incident management, incident command. Um, you brought that up.
Yeah.
I'm interested in kind of what your, if you could explain what that is and what the opportunities you see there are.
Sure. Yeah. This is a pretty heady wind down question, but incident management is the systems that you put in place, an organization or state, local territory, whatever, puts in place when there is an incident. That incident can be something like a natural hazard,
Mm.
like a hurricane. It could also be something like COVID, or it can be something like a big sporting event that is basically overwhelming the current systems that you have, the current structures that you have. Incident management is basically there to coordinate resources and ensure that things are distributed appropriately, and that as a situation evolves or changes, you can respond to it. So right now there's all of these health departments around the country setting up that have incident management teams for COVID-19. That's how they're sort of coordinating this and managing this. It's maybe we can nerd out about this a little bit more later, but there's some really interesting stuff associated with incident management. First, incident management is getting applied to a wider and wider array of incidents, not just hurricanes and not just wildfires where it sort of originated, but I'm seeing it used for homelessness. I'm seeing it used for the southern border opioid crisis, COVID, all of these atypical hazards. And my theory is that the systems that we have currently are so complex that they are, they're very efficient, but they're constantly breaking down. And so incident management is kind of emerging as this way of dealing with ossified bureaucratic systems that aren't necessarily working in today's world.
Mm-hmm.
The second part, and this ties much more into what we've been discussing, is incident management is designed as a multi-organizational system that anyone can and should link in with who's involved in a response. In reality, it's not. You need to know the sort of technical language of incident management, how an incident command structure is structured, who you should interface with, and you need to practice that and train it on a regular basis. So, I mean, even health departments that don't deal with disasters all the time, like a fire department, they're often not confident with incident management systems. Emergent groups, that's even harder. Like these little community-based organizations, NGOs, have a very hard time with interfacing with these systems. And
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I kind of view that as the big next step and the big sort of frontier for improving response, figuring out how to make those systems accessible and useful for these emergent responders.
Thank you for that, Aaron. And I wanted to bring that up before we wrapped up. I mean, there's one more question from one of our viewers that I'm going to pose to you for us to land with.
Mm.
So, one of the examples I'll give is in a previous life when I was the director of public health preparedness for the Boston Public Health Commission. Um, we redesigned our incident command system to make it a little bit easier to understand and navigate. We After we built out our community resilience program as part of our overall office, one of the uh, areas of work that our office did, we actually ended up creating a whole community resilience section
Mm.
of the work that we were doing back in the day, and then we used to create our situation reports, which are kind of like the summary of for this operational period, what are the priorities, what's happened, what's been done about it, and what's coming up next. Um, we used to create a sanitized version of that and give that to our community partners.
Mm.
And so there are so many ways that we can kind of connect the dots in really powerful ways. And then the last thing I'll say is on this front is that we've also, as All Aces, done some work with folks on thinking about what does it mean to embed racial equity, social justice into the incident command structure, right? Like, how do you have a role that is
Yeah.
explicitly at the decision making level, so that when those section chiefs go into behind closed doors and make decisions for the next operational period, that there's someone in that room who other folks in the command center have gone to with information that says, hey, here's the context of what's happening in communities. Hey, don't forget these things. That person isn't responsible for knowing all that stuff, but is the person that folks know they can go to, so that when we go into this behind these closed doors and make these decisions, which is a whole other piece of structural change that needs to happen. But when we do go behind the closed doors that to make these decisions, someone is there who has decision making power to be able to inform the conversation and challenge the group think that usually happens because people are exhausted and people just want trying to get through the day. So
I
I
love that, and I'm gonna steal that and
should absolutely
see if I can run with that a little bit. You
should.
know, like yeah, like we have logistics. You know, we have public information officers. We have all of these other roles that ensure stuff gets done. A vulnerability or an equity officer would be really useful for getting people to think about this stuff and making sure that it's sort of mainstreamed in the incident response, because it falls in the cracks. I mean, I think we're sort of walking with incident management right now. It still is kind of this thing that's a little bit new, and we're just learning how to do it. Next steps are really figuring out how to do it for everybody, not just the ones that are sort of easy to reach, which is how we're thinking now. It's Joe Public, who happens to be of a certain race and socioeconomic class.
Thank you for that, Aaron. And Monir Azam, who is lives in the climate mitigation world. Glad you're here, Monir. Um, Ask, if you're familiar with FEMA's hazard mitigation program, the BRIC. I know you are. And so, from where you sit and what you understand about how it's being approached, do you think that diversity, equity, inclusion is included in this program? And then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, I mean, I have some familiarity with BRIC. I think one of the things I've been thinking a lot with FEMA generally is how they go about making their decisions, and when it comes to mitigation itself. And typically mitigation is assessed based on property values. So it
Mhm.
structurally favors people who have property and are wealthy. I think reorienting around people rather than property would be quite useful. I know in the UK, for instance, their sort of flood mitigation ratings, they assign an extra 25% weight. I think it's 25%. It might be 50. I don't quite remember, but they assign an extra weight for lower economic classes in recognition that, you know, if you are poor, you're going to have a much harder time recovering from a disaster. So you should, and it's going to hurt a lot more. So you lose a buck and you're poor, hurts a lot more than if you lose a buck and you're Bill Gates. I think there's some sort of simple things that can be done with some of those metrics that could really help move decisions over and make them a little bit more equitable.
And on that note, what I will say is that I know that there were some folks who were in FEMA, particularly FEMA, which is, what does FEMA stand for again? Do you remember?
Federal insurance, is it insurance mitigation agency?
Agency. It's like an
Yeah.
agency. It's weird. So FEMA, the Federal Insurance and Mitigation Agency within FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, is the part of the organization that BRIC comes out of. And I know that some of the folks have tried to work as hard as they can in the current political climate to embed considerations around equity, but understanding the current political climate, right? That we have a president who has issued an executive order telling all federal agencies that they cannot do um, uh, racial equity, social justice workshops that use certain framing or words, and have since also stood up these quasi committees that employees of different federal departments can then complain to if they feel like their agency may have participated in something that made them uncomfortable. All of that to say that I think that it impacted the ability of this to be as equitable as it could have been explicitly, right? Because we know that when programs are not explicitly saying, we're worried about people of color, we're worried about poor people, we're worried about these very specific populations, it defaults to whatever is easiest and most comfortable for folks who are then on the receiving end of the money. So thank you for that question, Monir. I want to say thank you to all of our viewers tonight. Thank you for folks who have been posting and sharing their thoughts with us. Thank you, Aaron, for taking time out of your day in order to be here with us. I appreciate you so much. I appreciate your thoughtfulness, all of your hard work over the years. And I definitely will be following up with you because I think we have some good trouble to start.
Yeah, let's do that. And thank you so much for just inviting me and chatting. I feel like this work can be pretty hard sometimes, and it's really good to have a conversation and to kind of process some of that stuff. So yeah, thanks again for the invite. It was great.
Thank you. And so you all know, as always, I'm sending lots of love, hope, and action to each and every one of you. Please join us again next week. And for tonight, I just want to say thank you and we appreciate you.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.